Welcome everyone to another installment of the Spring Environmental Resilience Speaker Series, jointly presented by the Integrated Program in the Environment and the Environmental Resilience Institute at Indiana University. I'm Sarah Mincy, and I'm the Director of the Integrated Program in the Environment, and I'm so pleased that you're able to join us today. Both IPE and ERI are founded on the understanding that interdisciplinary learning and research are essential to teach today's scholars and to solve today's problems, not to mention tomorrow's. So we're really pleased to facilitate conversations with some of today's leading environmental resilience experts from across the disciplines to address challenges from climate change to other socio-environmental challenges that are affecting our health and our communities and our economy here in Bloomington and around the world. IPE was founded in 2012 by the provost and the leadership of the O'Neill School and the College of Arts and Sciences and the School of Public Health to bring together all of the environmental and sustainability scholarship across the various schools and departments on the Bloomington campus. And ERI was founded in 2017 as a part of the IU Prepared for Environmental Change Grand Challenge. Its mission is to enhance resilience to environmental change in Indiana and beyond by accurately predicting impacts and effectively partnering with communities to implement feasible, equitable, and research-informed solutions. IPE and ERI faculty and staff and students have worked really hard to bring you a robust set of speakers this semester every other Friday at noon. And in 2 weeks, I'm pleased that we'll be hosting our very own School of Public Health's Dr. Jackie McDonald Gibson. So mark your calendars for that talk. You'll be able to find information about each of these talks, of course, on the ERI and IPE web pages and in our regular newsletters. So be sure that you sign up for those and you'll get reminders about the upcoming talks and other news and events that we publicize. Finally, logistics on how you can engage today with our speaker. Please put your questions and comments as they come up into the chat, and I will monitor them through the speaker's talk and curate those to read to the speaker at the end. And we'll be happy for you to be putting those in throughout the talk while you think of them. So at long last, please let me introduce today's speaker, Dr. Stuart Pickett. Dr. Pickett is an urban ecologist at the Cary Institute of Ecosystem Studies in Millbrook, New York. He has a PhD from the University of Illinois, and his research focuses on the ecological structure of urban areas and the changes in vegetation through time after disturbance. He's worked in primary forests and post-agricultural fields in the eastern United States and in streamside woodlands and South African savannas. He believes that ecological knowledge about cities is crucial for both improving the environment and residents' well-being. He served as the director of the Baltimore Ecosystem Study for 18 years. He's written books on spatial patterns and their changes in ecology, humans as a part of ecosystems, conservation, how to connect ecology with urban design, and linking ecology with ethics. He has served as the president of the Ecological Society of America and is on the boards of the American Institute of Biological Sciences and the City as Living Laboratory. Dr. Pickett, we are very honored to have you today. Thank you so much for joining us, and I'm going to turn it over to you to talk about what ecology has to do with race.
Thank you very much. It is a pleasure to be here. Even though here is, let's see, even though here is quite dispersed. So it's maybe I should say I'm happy to share electrons with you all today. So I'm going to give you, let's see, I have to hit this, I guess. All different ways to get these things going. I'm going to start out with sort of two kinds of affirmations. One, deals with a particular kind of past and a presence. That's not a typo. I mean that to bring us into the present and the future. And this is a poem written by a friend of mine for his children. He is one of the leading griots in the Gambia, And this is a poem that he wrote for his children. Of course, being a griot is a sort of a hereditary kind of thing. And so I acknowledge my African roots in this way, and also honor my godsons who have taught me a lot about race from a different perspective. The second one is, since I'm sitting here in Poughkeepsie, New York, I have to acknowledge the indigenous peoples who have been and are still a part of the heritage and the traditions of this region. The Wappinger people are no longer a unit that is expressed locally. They've been absorbed into bands who moved west, but the Wappingers are the ones who gave the name to Poughkeepsie, Upuku Ipising, the shady place by the shady reed-covered lodge by the Little Water Place. And so Poughkeepsie's founded on a small tributary of the Hudson. The Lenape and the Mohicans are still part of the region. The Mohicans have a really wonderful phrase. They call themselves the people of the waters that are never still. And that perfectly reminds us of the long-term connection of people to the tidal Hudson River on which Poughkeepsie is located. So in addition, though, to acknowledging these pasts and presences, I want to add another layer of tradition. And Sojourner Truth, who was born a slave in 1797 across the Hudson, upriver a little bit from Poughkeepsie, who was, of course, a conductor on the Underground Railroad, a fierce abolitionist and a fierce advocate for women's rights, is also part of our heritage here in the Hudson Valley, and I want to acknowledge that as well. Now, I'm going to tell you two different stories. One will be a relatively personal story, but that is going to focus on the idea of race as an individual phenomenon. And this is sort of a major tradition of thinking about race in the States in particular. More recently, people have begun to think about race as a social apparatus, a system of racism. And that's the second story I will tell you. And then I will bring something of these two stories together at the end to say what this might invite ecology to do in the future. So I'm going to start out, obviously, as you've been told, in Louisville, Kentucky. And I come by the locution, you all, honestly, that's a Kentucky thing. And so if you've heard people a little bit from the south of Bloomington talking that way instead of you all or rather y'all or yous guys or youans, which you could do upriver a little bit in Pennsylvania. That's where I come from. And so my story starts there. It occurred to me that I was going to say something about being downhill from Bloomington, but then I said, well, no, I need to figure out where the watershed boundaries are. And if I were live with you, I'd ask you what watershed Bloomington is in. And so some of you may know that, some of you may not. I think it's really important for people to kind of anchor themselves in place in different ways. And one of the things we do in Baltimore is to ask in our social survey, do you live in a watershed? And 40% of the people in Baltimore acknowledge that they live in the watershed. Some people say no, but a plurality say, yes, we do live in a watershed. And about 10% say, I don't know. But by the way, the Bloomington is in the Wabash watershed. And so water that you spill in Bloomington does not come to Louisville. So I just thought that was new for me. So I want to start with the individual model of race. And this is sort of the familiar American way to think about it, other places as well. Race is most often thought about as a biological phenomenon. You know, it's one's inheritance. One comes from this or that other part of the world and shares characteristics with other people from there. And then you have the categorization based on that. But race also is law, and some of you may know that in the American South that obviously there was a lot of mixture because, well, enslaved people can't say no. And so there was a law that essentially the social scientists call it hypodescent, that if you have mixture, the categorization goes with the way the mother was categorized, or the enslavement goes with the mother's condition. So race as law is a big part of our tradition in the United States. And some people talk about this as the one drop rule. One drop, quote, of African blood and you're Black or you're African American. So another way to think about it is that race can be an individual categorization. And then so these days on census forms, one gets to acknowledge what race, if any, one wants to claim. But maybe more broadly in the individual model of race, race is something that sort of enjoins a responsibility that's attributed to a group. One has a responsibility toward a group, or sometimes when there are untoward events, when there are unfortunate activities perpetrated by a member of a recognized group, that becomes a characteristic that a burden that other people in that group have to share. So as a member of a certain race, one in the individual school of race relations, one has responsibility for the race. That's kind of W.E.B. Du Bois kind of approach. But in one sees in headlines and editorials and news pieces that blame is also part of that individual model of race. Now, I'm going to give you my own history in race. This is the Simmons College faculty, which was established. The college was established in Louisville in 1897. It was the first college established by African Americans in the state of Kentucky. And it was associated with the American Baptist Church, that's the Black Baptist Church. And two of my great-grandparents are in this picture. William H. Stewart on your left, and Mamie E. Stewart, his wife, on the right. He was an editor of the newspaper for the Black Baptist Church. He was acting president of this college for a year. My great-grandmother was a music teacher. She also was the organist at the church that they attended. So these are my deep Kentucky roots. So 4 generations ago. And so I come by my sort of professorial leanings kind of honestly. This you know, I didn't make this stuff up. I lean on these folks. But let me get a little closer to my own parents. So my father, who was born an amazing number, he's no longer alive, but he was quite an old man when he got married. And so I have to point to the fact that he was a member of the first official Negro Boy Scout troop in Louisville, Kentucky. That troop was founded in 1916. And later, he was among the first Black Boy Scout professional executives in the United States. Now, depending on which sources you read, there were 3 who were appointed at the same time, or 4. I can't quite sort that out. But in the mid-30s, he was appointed as a Boy Scout executive, and he was assigned to, quote, the colored division. And he did things like help establish camps for the Black Scouts. And he ran camps for many years. He also did a lot of fundraising and collecting materials for the Boy Scouts. And he was much more a social being than I ever will be. And this is a picture of him from the 30s, soon after he got that job. Now, my mother worked in the Louisville Free Public Library. And this, you can't read that historic marker, but it basically says that what is now called the Western branch of the Louisville Free Public Library was established in 1908 as the colored branch of the library. And in 1949, my mother came up from Georgia, part of the Great Migration, to be a librarian in the colored branch. And this is her picture in 1952, obviously considerably younger than my father. So these are the folks that I come from. But let me partly, I'm telling you this story to relate to place and the role of race in an individual case. So this is the house I grew up in. no longer exists. It was demolished in urban renewal. It's now land that's occupied by some of the hospital complexes in Louisville. So if you drive down 65, you're within a few blocks of this location. A wonderful old Italianate Victorian house. Great place for two little boys to get into trouble in. But in urban renewal, then, what happens? Well, here's a map of Louisville. And since Louisville is named for Louis the 14th, the map happens to be in French. Don't ask me how is it that the best map of Louisville I could find was in French. But so you see here, I'm going to show you some geography. If you look at the street grid, you can figure out where the flatland is and where the uplands are. But it's a little hard, so I'll help you out. So to the right of that, to the east of that is the highlands, and everything else down toward the west is the floodplain. So you get a nice clean grid in the floodplain, and you get a mess up in the highlands where it's hillier. Standard kind of urban design. There's another sort of odd thing here. This is I hope you can see the cursor. This was originally the city of Portland. Portland, this is the Falls of the Ohio. You can't get a boat beyond this before they put in the locks and the dam. So there was a city below the falls and a city above the falls. You had to stop your boat, unload, move the stuff overland, and get it going. And that's why Louisville is here. But this little neighborhood of Portland, it was originally a different city, and you see its grid faces the river, and the rest of the grid is spread from Louisville. Okay, that's too much geography, but I love this stuff. So the little red dot that just popped up there is the house that I showed you in the floodplain, very near the main sorts of commercial streets, in walking distance of what used to be the Haymarket, which now people would proudly call a farmer's market. We just thought it was a bunch of sheds where people sold all kinds of crazy stuff. And in urban renewal, my father was in looking for a house, looked up here in the Highlands. And this little red dot shows kind of the neighborhood where he looked. And one of the things that happened when these are sort of early 20th century bungalows, nice kind of early American suburban development, if you will. And the realtor at some point learned that my father was Black, and maybe you could see how my freckly father might not be instantly identified as Black. But when this real estate agent found out that we were Black, he said, "I can't sell you a house up here. I would lose my license." So that was, okay, maybe this is just some individual bad behavior. But that's race in that has our environmental consequences. So what did we do? That neighborhood was not a possibility. So we ended up going out here to the west end, right across from one of Louisville's Olmsted Parks, a very pleasant neighborhood. But this was a place where urban renewal opened the doors for us. So let's think about this, individual behavior. I was taught that, you respect people unless they give you a reason not to respect you, respect them. So you're dealing with individual good behavior, bad behavior, or maybe behavior that's kind of neutral to you. Another thing about the individual model of behavior is that there's traditionally the talk that Black parents give their kids is that you work twice as hard because the individual bad behavior is stacked against you. That's a very standard kind of aspect of the talk. Other aspects of the talk, of course, which continue are to avoid conflict, to avoid situations that get you into trouble, given that there are people out there who can behave badly as individuals. So it's sort of chalked up to individual bigotry. That's sort of the model, individual bigotry. Now, when we moved, we were the first Black family on the block, and my brother, some number of years younger than I, matched the age of the two little boys next door. And so they They played with each other quite frequently until at some point their parents said, no, they told their kids they can't play with the black kids next door. So, okay, there's some more individual bad behavior. We'll live, find other people to play with. In high school, I attended junior high school downtown in the old neighborhood, but moved to a high school that was, when I began, half white and half black. So this churning of the neighborhood as Black folks from the urban renewed part of Louisville sought housing and ended up in the West End. You might call this white flight. So, people for various reasons say, well, I'm not going to stay in this neighborhood. Maybe it's more bad behavior, or maybe it's just watching out for their property values. So maybe you can call this neutral behavior. So this is sort of the way I was brought up to think about race. And that's maybe one of the reasons why I, as an ecologist, didn't really pay attention to race. My race or race in general did not enter into how I did ecology for decades and decades. Now, you begin to get a taste of something other than individual good or bad behavior when you look at this map. This is the redlining map of Louisville, Kentucky, which was, I don't remember what year exactly. These were all done in the middle 1930s. It was sort of a recovery from the Great Depression kind of activity. The federal government said, give people money so that they can buy houses. But they weren't giving money to everybody. So now here are the highlands again. The green areas are the neighborhoods that are ranked perfectly good places to give people mortgage loans. Those are going to be situations where you're going to be paid back. Blue is the next best. Yellow is a little bit hazardous, a little bit risky in the judgment of the people doing this. And red is don't give these people a mortgage no matter what. Now, these things a lot of these maps have been digitized by the University of Virginia. And if you're curious, you can look up some number of about 150 cities. And when you click on these areas, they will give you the summary of what the assessors said about these neighborhoods. And very typically, these are stable, single family neighborhoods, the green ones, the ones that are ranked highest. And then you end up down with the red line, which is where the word comes from, the red zones, which are described as things like Negro encroachment, poor quality housing, a lot of recent immigrants. And you look at these things now and you say, well, when I first became aware of redlining maps, studying Baltimore and looked at the descriptions, it was horrifying. It was horrifying. It was just raw racism. But these things have legacies. The difference in trees, the difference in heat islands, the difference in wealth accumulation. If people cannot get a mortgage, how do they accumulate wealth? And these were the very regions that cities so often said, well, we've got to make some new room for new investment. So let's tear down these red areas. Very, very common. Very, very common. So the area that we had been steered to was in one of the second graded areas, but let me show you some other terms that go along with this. We're beginning to see it's not just a story about individual racism. There was racial steering that real estate industry involved us in, and there was block busting. Our family was used to bust a block and generate real estate business by, once you would get one Black family in a block, then the realtors would visit everybody else, the white families on the block, and say, there are Black people coming, so you better sell, and I'll be happy to help you sell this house. You can see that's a bit self-serving. White flight, which is often presented as an individual rational decision, is is a lot based on discriminatory lending. Where did these white people go? They went to the suburbs where they could get an FHA loan, which Black people at the time could not. Until the Fair Housing Act of 1968, of the millions of loans that the Federal Housing Administration supported or backed, 2% of them were to Black people. So there was discriminatory lending that disadvantaged the people in the red zones, but encouraged people who were moving from red and blue and red, yellow, and blue zones to go to green field suburbs where they could get these federally subsidized loans. In fact, the federal government, the FHA, would not approve certain subdivisions if they wouldn't assure that the houses were not available to Black people. Okay, I've got too many negatives in there, but basically the structure of suburbia was racially exclusive through most of the early history of suburbia, discriminatory lending. And what you get then is subsidized suburban pull factors, the interstate highway systems, which is a federally, the states put very little money into these expressways that move people back and forth from suburbs and cities. So you begin to get a sense that, maybe it's not just individual bad behavior. Maybe it is a system. And so the title, I wrote a little article for The Nature of Cities, which you can find by going to that website. But what I know now is based on my work in Baltimore, and you don't do work in Baltimore unless you understand racism. It's been supported by the Baltimore Ecosystem Study, the new emerging Baltimore Ecosystem Alliance. And the idea that when you do ecology of the whole city, you have to understand how people are making decisions that influence the environment and how the environment is influencing the decisions people make. So the city is essentially a social ecological research subject, not just an ecological research subject. And these projects dealt with education and engagement and also co-production, working with city agencies and communities. So all of these things together have helped me to understand how racism is not only a system, but it's one that's embedded in the ecology of American cities. So if you look at the distribution of race in Baltimore, this is from, I think it's updated to 2016 from the American Communities Survey, but green represents individual. Each dot is an individual. It represents Black folks, blue represents white folks, red is Asians, and orange is Latinos. So this is a pattern that continues. This looks a lot like a redlining map, and it's the same pattern. And you don't get the same pattern just by choice. I think you get it through a system. I know you get it from a system. And this is very common. Just look at these 6 cities. Baltimore is one of them. Highly segregated cities in the United States. It's not just these 6 cities. Here's one way to look at segregation: neighborhood diversity. How diverse is each neighborhood? Notice it caps out at 80. And how diverse is the whole city in terms of racial composition? If there were no segregation, you would expect the one-to-one line. You would expect neighborhoods to be at the diversity of the city and the neighborhood would be equivalent. If it's less than one-to-one, that indicates that the city is segregated. I think it's a pretty clever way to represent it. And you see that very few American cities get even close to the one-to-one line. And many of them are very far away. Baltimore, my beloved Baltimore, pretty far away from that one-to-one line. So what we're looking at is a system in action. And if you look at the word segregation, it comes from the Latin to mean to separate from the flock. Sheep don't segregate themselves. Sheep don't separate themselves. The guy who's in charge segregates the flock. And so segregation might seem like a neutral term for people just being in different places, but this system shows that segregation is generated at the expense of those with less power. this segregation can be based on race, it can be based on color, it can be based on class, a number of other things, but at least these things. But these rankings are socially created. These are socially created things. Is there a role of biology? Well, of course there's a role of biology. People differ in all kinds of amazing ways. But thinking about four races, which is the traditional way of looking at it, which was established by Linnaeus, right, in the 1700s. What Linnaeus was doing was cataloging resources for the European empires. Race was a part of that project. And so I tend to talk not about race, because there aren't just four races here, but there is racialization. There's a social process that says we are going to categorize people in these ways. And furthermore, we're going to rank them. And that's the essence of racism, generating race as a social category and then ranking people by those racialized categorizations. And then you operate segregation and discrimination and so on. So here's our milestone. Let's touch base a bit here. Racism is a system or a social apparatus. It's based on formal regulations and laws, but it's also based on informal norms and popular images and stereotypes. The American popular culture has built these things up for several hundred years. Now, I'm going to show you how this works in action, give you an example that uses the adaptive cycle of resilience. And I'm going to show you segregation in Baltimore, how it operates through this cycle. This is one way to represent the cycle. This is, Hollings and Gunderson and those guys. So capital and connectedness increase as systems change through time. That's your expectation. I could also put on here that it's the theory of what's his name? Joseph Tainter on collapse of complex societies. So that's your expectation. So you have a social system, a social ecological system that becomes highly resource containing and conservative of the resources. If there's disturbance, some of the resources can be released, and then you have the opportunity for reorganization as the resources become available. Growth occurs as the available resources are again resorbed into the system. So you get this cycle. If you don't lose resources here, or if you don't lock in the conservative system, you can run this cycle forever. That's the theory. That's the sort of ideal theory. What does this look like in Baltimore? Baltimore was founded in 1792. This is an 1800s map, maybe about 1840s. And I'm showing you a major street. And here are the footprints of the row houses on the major streets. They're about 4 rooms deep, 2 or 3 stories tall, decent backyard. These are the structures on the alleys. This is the alleyways are sometimes not even much more than a sidewalk. You can maybe get a single horse cart down here, but that's about it. 2 stories tall, 2 rooms deep. Look at these things. These things were built for the enslaved people, the indentured servants, and the new immigrants. The bosses and the people in charge lived on the street fronts. One other just little minor thing. What this shows is that there's very fine scale there's segregation, but it's very fine scale in Baltimore of the 1800s. And one of the ways I can illustrate this church here, I'm guaranteeing you there are no Black people living in any of these big houses here. This church is noted to be a Negro church, St. Paul's Methodist Episcopal Church. And there's another little church here that probably is also a Black church. This is the Pyrochemical Company. Different way to put together a city. But at any rate, this is sort of the conservative state of Baltimore in the late 1800s. What's next? All right. This is the state of fine scale segregation. This is our conserved state. What disturbs that? after the Civil War and after the collapse, or the actual, I should say, the withdrawal of Reconstruction after the Civil War. So about 10 years, Black folks had a measure of freedom and civic participation. As that was shut down in the late 1870s, the Great Migration began. Black people began to flee the oppression of the South, the terrorism of the South, and the lack of opportunity for doing anything other than sort of the standard, sharecropping, which was little better than slavery. So the Great Migration began. That puts pressure on neighborhoods beyond the alley houses in Baltimore. So Black people, those are incredibly crowded neighborhoods. You get more Black people who cannot live on the main streets, but they start looking for places elsewhere in the city. What happens? Well, the folks who are in charge, the elites, the white power structure of Baltimore says, no, you don't. They established in 1911 the first American ordinance to segregate white people and Black people residentially. Now, San Francisco had a residential ordinance restricting where Asians could live from the late, I think, 1890s. It's hard to find the date of that. I'm not that much of a scholar, but so San Francisco had done the same thing with Asians about 20 or 30 years earlier. Baltimore was the first one to do this kind of ordained segregation of Black people. They said Black people and white people cannot live on the same blocks. So that is now a new scale of segregation. It's still segregation. What do you notice here? We often in ecology and urban studies, urbanism, sustainability studies, we often think about resilience as a good thing. Here's an example of resilience not being a good thing. Watch out for bad resilience. So there's this blockwise segregation ordinance, and everybody they congratulated Baltimore on this. Oh, you're brilliant. In 1917, the Supreme Court invalidated the Louisville ordinance. And I'm proud to say that my great-grandfather was one of the people who was the founder of the chapter of the NAACP in Louisville that brought the suit that went to the Supreme Court that invalidated these nutty segregation ordinances aimed at Black people. I don't know if it did much about the Asians. I actually don't know that. But then what happens? The elites in Baltimore say, well, we still don't want to live with Black people. What are we going to do? So they invigorate or establish neighborhood improvement associations that are tools of neighborhood exclusion. And they do that in two ways. They lobby the city government because these are the people with power to be helpful to segregation. But one of the things that they did, and the first deed covenants against Black people and Jews were invented in Baltimore, and they were really spread then. They were invented by the Roland Park Company, which is one of the first suburbs in the United States. And again, Baltimore is really creative about race. But deed covenants that said, you can't sell this house to a Black person. You cannot sell this house to a Jewish person. And so that led to coarser scale segregation, still segregation, coarser scale. So this shows you how a resilient cycle can work for things that are not positive socially. Redlining, and I showed you the Louisville maps. This is the Baltimore map. Again, the middle 1930s. Classification based on mortgage worthiness. This was done in 239 American cities. I bet you can't even name 239 American cities in one sitting. And what they did was these redlining maps incorporated local racial prejudices, local class prejudices, and anti-immigrant prejudices. This wasn't just the federal government coming in saying, do this. This was a partnership with the local mores about race and class. And these have had incredible enduring social and biophysical legacies. But the important thing isn't to just go back to redlining and figure out why our cities look like they do, but to recognize that this is part of an ongoing cycle of resilience of segregation. And this, again, this is the Baltimore map in the 2020s or the 2010s, 2020s. It's just making a more spatially extensive pattern. So racism is a persistent driver in our American cities. Segregation generates outcomes that affect the environment, air, water, energy, and biodiversity. This little pair of pictures here is one of my most poignant sets of pictures. On the right, you have a neighborhood of row houses that was demolished. All that's left is the lowest step of these marble stoops, the famous Baltimore marble stoops. And I was down with a class of one of my colleagues, giving them a field trip in Baltimore. And a middle-aged Black man walked up to us and said, "What are you doing?" Not in any sort of threatening or possessive way, but "What are you doing?" And so I told him what we were doing. And this man he stands at this very spot and points around this block, say, "This was my aunt's house over here. Here's the house this was the house I grew up in." Now, a few years later, I was with a class. I was hosting a class from another institution, landscape architecture. And landscape architects, they all have their phone and they're out doing their videos. The students are running around. And the professor and I were standing and talking, and he asked me, and I know this guy, so I know he knew the answer, but he said, "Why does this neighborhood look like this?" And so I gave him the list of things, some of which were scholarship based on other people's studies of structure of American cities. Some was my experience in Baltimore. It looks like this because of redlining. It looks like this because of discriminatory zoning. It looks like this because of discriminatory lending. It looks like this because of the way we fund public schools. It looks like this because of where we put public housing and don't put public housing. This is a list of about 12 things. And he nodded because he's from St. Louis. He knows the answers as well as I do. But then a few days later, I go back home. I come back to Poughkeepsie, and I wake up at 5 in the morning and I say, I could have given the same list in this other neighborhood, the suburban neighborhood. It's the same list of things, just operating for the benefit or the burden of different people. So these two pictures are two sides of the same coin. That was a watershed moment for me. So environmental justice, I want to acknowledge that, of course, environmental justice is a long-term activist and scholarly pursuit, and it takes the arrow from environmental features to the existence of equity or not. And that's how you judge environmental justice or injustice. But the thing here is that you tend to think of the environment as given. You have your map and you link to to whether you have equitable distribution of burdens and benefits. And that's an important thing to do. We need a lot more of it. But one of the things I've shown you with that resilience cycle is that the environment isn't fixed. And there are social decisions that lead to what that environment is. So what we really need to be looking at is a cycle of justice or inequity through environment, conditioned by segregation and racism, among other things. So this gives us a little bit different way to think about environmental justice. And of course, you take this through time as well. So environment's not as fixed, environments has changed, and racism being a part of the causes of the alteration of environment. Notice, please, I am not saying that race alters environment. I am not saying that. Just, this is something we have to be very careful about. What this does is it suggests a research agenda for ecology. Just pure ecology, just because you love ecology. There's new stuff we need to know in this historical cycle of change and the spatial distribution of benefit and burden and ecosystem function and plant community structure and biodiversity. There's a research agenda that's underdeveloped. And we can use that to close a social ecological loop. All right, let me bring these two stories together. Racism is a social system. It's not just individual good or bad behavior. Racism creates segregation. Racism is the driver. There's probably another phrase that we could put even farther behind racism, and we can talk about that later if you want. But one of the things we have to understand better is segregated ecologies, ecological patterns and processes through space. But in so doing, we don't want to just come in like, black helicopter science or just use remote sensing and not understand that we're dealing with people's stories. We have to understand people's histories. So I've given you a sense of my own history. I gave you a sense of that anonymous man's history. In Baltimore, at that row of empty stoops, it's really important to know those stories. And also to respect communities' needs and fears, not again to just come in and do research that looks like you're blaming people. Don't go back to that old, the talk, it's not just, Black people are not only responsible for what happens to Black people. All right, so is there such a thing as an anti-racist ecology? If systemic racism created segregated environments, which have burdens to lower class people, poor people, people of color, people who are not empowered in various societies. If these environments are created, they can be changed. That's the good news. But to do that, we have to link social and ecological knowledge. And that's a big job for urban ecology. That's a big job for resilience studies. That's a big job for sustainability studies. And these are stories that can happen not only in the United States. It's, maybe it won't be black-white race in other places. I mean, you think about indigenous cultures in the United States, in various places in the world, link ecological and social knowledge. But perhaps one of the things that we should always do is to be sure that we have anti-racism in our visions of what cities need to be in the future, regardless of whether our research or our work addresses that, any individual project addresses that directly. And thinking about anti-racist ecology, I said back when I talked about the stories of the individual model of racism, you can have good behavior, you can have bad behavior, you can have neutral behavior. Scholars of race and social sciences and people involved in environmental justice and ethics are reminding us that there is no neutral. There is no neutral. If we're not doing something actively to combat racism as a structure, as a social apparatus, we're doing might as well be just helping it. So there you go. That's my story, or my two stories. And my challenge for the future, my challenge that my great-grandparents and my parents left me, I pass that on to you now. And I thank you all for your attention. And I note here some of my colleagues who are involved in this thinking and writing with me. So I will stop sharing the screen and hand it back to you all.
Thank you so much, Dr. Pickett. That was an incredible talk. And all of the comments that I'm getting in chat are just to that point. So I think people have really been enlightened and we appreciate it. Just a reminder for you guys to put questions or comments into the chat and I can read those to Dr. Pickett. So the first one that's interesting to me as well is someone asking if you could talk a little bit more about, I guess explicitly, about the mechanisms behind the impacts on green infrastructure, urban green infrastructure that come from systemic racism. So what impacts, green spaces or canopy cover that's connected to the systematic racism?
One clear signal that we see in Baltimore, for example, is that there is actually a lot of green in some of the underserved Black neighborhoods in Baltimore, but it tends to be volunteer vegetation. It tends to be dominated by Tree of Heaven and Princess Tree and Norway Maple. It's what else? What are the mulberry? I think white mulberry, for example. So they're not particularly they're just, species that make do where they can make do. And although I must say that I grew up with a massive specimen tree of ailanthus, and when they get old and large, they can be really quite beautiful. Just don't build a fire with them. But so the vegetation in these underserved neighborhoods tends to be volunteer vegetation. It tends to be on the back lots. It tends to be on the hedgerows. It's not managed. It's not designed to perform functions that people have chosen. Whereas in think about the green areas in the redlining map in Baltimore, there the things are planted intentionally. There are resources to maintain them, private resources, or there's pressure on the city by the community groups to maintain the local parks. So they can direct the public funds to the amenities in their neighborhoods, whereas the disempowered neighborhoods don't have that kind of pull with City Hall. Also, the parks are a little bit older style and they're more formal, kind of mid 19th century parks. So there's a difference in the style of green infrastructure. There's a difference in where it is in the block. Is it on the street or is it back behind the houses? And people in Baltimore do not live in the backyard. Baltimore is a street-focused city. I mean, it's built to be a street-focused city, the old part of the city. And so I think the green area in Baltimore, the forest cover in Baltimore, the tree cover in Baltimore is about 21% right now. And the city wants to increase that to 40, or about nearly 40%. And one of the things that we have helped the city understand is that most of that's going to have to be done on private land, because there's not enough land in the public right of way to do it. And so it's really means that people have to think about what people in different neighborhoods want, what people in different neighborhoods feel they have a capacity to manage, or what kinds of burdens they're afraid of from green space. So there really needs to be a much more, just don't roll out a map and say, where are there no trees? And we're going to put trees there. That's a place to start, but then you really have to get into the social differentiation. So yeah, Baltimore is doing a lot of good work on that. And more and more cities in their plans, we have a project that's looked at the plans of 20 cities. It ends up being about 120 plans that have anything to do with green infrastructure. And one of the things we find is that maybe half of them mention equity, but a much, much smaller percentage of these plans say, here's how you deal with equity. Here's how you make sure that your green infrastructure planning ends up being equitable and just. Okay, I'm rambling too much, but.
Oh, that was great. And it connects a bit with the next question. What would anti-racist zoning and subdivision ordinances look like?
I'm for a lot of this, I have to depend on the readings of historians and social scientists who dig much more deeply into that stuff than I do. But single family zoning is something that is it sounds like a neutral thing, but it is a tool that plays into the hands of racism. And some of the first single family zoning that was that was done in this community was in Berkeley, California. And, the good thing about going back into the historical records, especially during the era of Jim Crow, is that people, if people were racist or if they were bigoted, they put it down on paper. Which people don't do now. But you go back into this history and you see that the single family zoning or the lot size zoning was expressly done to keep Black people and Asian people in certain places in Berkeley and Oakland, and to reserve certain other areas for white people. I mean, they're just that blunt about it. And so zoning, single family zoning was one of the tools where you can put apartment houses, even multiple unit apartment houses. California is right now exploring having I actually shouldn't say exactly, but I think trying to prevent municipalities from not allowing any sort of apartments or multifamily zoning. And that's one of the big things that leads to racial and class segregation in this country. So we need to get rid of that.
Yeah. Are there some cities that are doing good work against the legacy of redlining that you can think of?
You know, these patterns are so deep in America, and our urban estate, so to speak, is so highly fragmented that it is really hard to say if you go to Detroit or you go to Baltimore and you say the city needs to do this. I was listening to a talk by Lawrence Brown, who's at University of Wisconsin now, and he did a lot of work on the racial patterns in Baltimore, and he's saying, here are the things that the city needs to do. And yeah, nodding, yeah. And I didn't ask him this, but well, and how do you expect the city to do that when we've had decades and decades of intentional, and again, the historians are my sources here, and Hackworth, forget his first name, has written a book recently called Manufacturing Decline. And one of the things he talks about is how cities have become hemmed in by other jurisdictions that then do not, the resources are restricted. So the things that cities can do are very restricted in sort of correcting for the problems of redlining. And in fact, now a lot of state level regulations motivated by the suburbanization of political power in many of our states prevents cities from doing things that would help solve those problems. So these things need to be addressed on statewide and regional levels. And we need to recognize that some policies that look neutral are in fact preventing us from correcting the problems of redlining.
Yeah, good point. Can you speak a bit to how the urban landscape, like having trees or not having trees in your neighborhood, shapes people's views or definitions of nature, and how that impacts one's perspective on conservation and restoration, I guess, particularly in line with race?
You know, one of the things that I have been so pleased about in Baltimore is that we have a cadre of people who are really good. Not everybody in the project, but some of our educators, some of our scientists of all colors are really good about going into neighborhoods, going into schools, and exposing kids and teachers and parents who happen to walk by to the fact that there's nature in their neighborhood. There's nature in their neighborhood and there are natural processes in their neighborhood. And so I think that one of our biggest jobs as a society, and what we in the sciences can do, is to act like our cities are not different from not separate from nature, to keep our eyes open for the connections of nature in cities and to share that knowledge with people. And I think urban ecology has made some considerable progress toward that.
Great point. Well, it's 1 o'clock, Dr. Pickett. There's so many more questions I wish we could get to, but we thank you very much for your time today. Such a wonderful talk. It has been recorded, and we'll have it posted on the ERI and IPE websites. So thank you again, everyone, for joining us, and a special thanks to Dr. Pickett. A round of applause virtually for you. Thank you. Everyone, join us for our next talk on April 2nd with our School of Public Health Professor McDonald Gibson. Thank you all for joining us. Have a great day.